that my good friends know about me is that I love to make lists. I love to rank things, categorize them, gather them together. So today, I'm going to be writing out on paper my top 100 favorite albums of all time list. This, of course, is an ever-changing list, a list that I refresh often as I discover new albums, build reappreciations for older albums, and some albums that just don't hold up over time. But as of September 15th, 2023, this is the list that I have made at its most refreshed. This list is on Spotify under my Spotify artists page in my playlist section. However, that playlist is only comprised of albums that are on Spotify, and there are a couple of albums that I think need to be appreciated and thrown onto this list as well. This weekend is also Mexican Independence Day, and I live in Pilsen in Chicago, which is a predominantly Mexican neighborhood. So I apologize in advance for interruptions or sounds that you may hear about in the neighborhood. People partying, people driving around in their cars with their Mexican flags. This is kind of my everything notebook. It's got a lot of random stuff in here. Get these loose pages out of the way. We'll pick out a pen here. I think I'm going to go with this one right here. We will call this Toloro's Top 100 Albums. We'll mark the date. So let's jump into it. Make our way from the albums that just made the cut up to the very tippy top of the list. Number 100 on the list, the album Amok by the band Atoms for Peace. This is a side project from Tom York of Radiohead with Flea of the Red Hot Chili Peppers together. They made one album, and it was fantastic, and still holds up today. I think it was maybe 2013, maybe a little earlier. Number 99. Super Snooper by the band Snooper. It's a relatively new album. It just came out this summer from a band that I'd been anticipating a debut album from for a while. They put it out and it did not disappoint, and it immediately got thrown on the list. I've listened to it maybe 10 times already. Number 98. Hourglass by Dearly Somber. These guys are from Chicago. I never heard of them until I saw them open up for another band of homies of mine, and I was quite blown away. And this album holds a lot of praise in the Chicago scene. I've run into these guys a couple of times. Some of the members of Dearly Somber share a practice space with us. So I've seen them time and time again. Number 97. Boxer by The National. The National is a band that has maintained a pretty steady fan base over the years. But the Boxer, or just Boxer, is the album that really got them a lot of acclaim and made them a well-known entity. Number 96. Boardwalk Bumps. By Englewood. It's an album that I discovered from YouTube algorithms back when I was interested in a lot of lo-fi beats back in college, and this was one of the first ones that I knew by name, that I listened to a lot, and it still holds up to this day. Number 95. Haunted Castle. I'm gonna write extended play, even though it's not an EP. It's an extension of an album called Haunted Castle by a band called French Police. These guys are also from Chicago, and I've been a big fan of them for a while, and they've really gone places, done a lot of touring. It's funny how I like this album more than the actual album that this is a part of. Number 94. White Pony by the band Deftones. Deftones is a band that I was kind of late to the game. I never even really heard of them until I moved to Chicago, but I was quite taken away by them, and there's a handful of Deftones albums that are going to make it onto this list, and that's the first one. So 93. This one's kind of a compilation, but it's only album this artist under this alias ever had. Songs and Demos 2015 to 2017 by Memo Boy. Memo Boy was the high school alias of a musician now known as Otto, but I like his older stuff way more than his current stuff, and I think a lot of other people do too. 92. This one's kind of a long album name, so I'm just going to shorten it up a little bit. The full album is called A Collection of Rarities and Previously Unreleased Material, but we'll just call it A Collection of Rarities, and that's by one of my favorite musicians, John Mouse. There's probably a couple John Mouse albums that'll be on this list. Number 91. Spent Passions 2. By 18 Karat Affair. 18 Karat Affair is one of the OG Vaporwave artists before Vaporwave really had a name, and his style has not changed much since he first started, but this is one of the more recent albums, and it's pretty good. It's got a lot of songs. It's more like sound art than I guess songs, I suppose. Alrighty, so now we have 90, and that is going to be The Velvet Underground and Nico by, you guessed it, The Velvet Underground. I feel this is a band that's kind of been a little bit lost to time. People these days don't quite appreciate them, but this album was kind of a marvel for its era, and it sounds so incredibly unique, and it's kind of a primo example of unintentionally lo-fi music that has appeal for being so crunchy and DIY, and it's a lot of really pretty songs too. Number 89. Sounds like we got a plane flying overhead here. The album Bright Moments by Flamingosis. I've been a fan of Flamingosis for a long time. Actually knew a bunch of his songs from playlists on YouTube's without ever knowing who he was or the name of the songs. So number 88. Since I Left You by the group The Avalanches. The Avalanches are a very sparse duo. They've only released 3 albums within the 24 years that they've been around, but the first one they did is absolutely remarkable. One of the best produced albums ever made. And followed by another one of the greatest albums, or best produced albums ever made. I'm going to write in parentheses, Justice. The Cross album is what they call it, by the French house duo Justice. These guys are kind of the second wave of, actually they're part of the third wave of French house, but they're kind of like Daft Punk, like the following decade, followed in their footsteps. And their first album is also quite remarkable. Over like probably 400 samples, like sampled across both these albums each. So number 86. Fear of a Blank Planet by the band. Porcupine Tree, like a British prog rock band, and this album is basically a rock opera about the inevitable death of our human race as it becomes more dependent on technology. Kind of a change of pace from some of the albums here. Number 85. Turn on the Bright Lights by the band Interpol. I'm a big Interpol fan, and that's their first album, and it's a quintessential album of the post-punk revival of the New York scene in the early 2000s. Alright, number 84. Pop Food by Jack Stauber. He's a artist that I've admired for a long time, mostly for his visuals. But when that album came out, it was a sign that he actually could make decently developed music as well. Number 83. Drunk by Thundercat. He's an exceptional bass player. He's made his way all around the music industry with his unique wad envelope bass sound. Number 82. Flying Microtonal Banana. I'm not even sure if I have enough room to write out this band's name, but I'll just write the shortened version. King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard. As a band around this time I was really, really into. And when that album came out, it was something I'd never heard of. Being able to make psychedelic music with the sounds that they did with the gear that they did was unheard of. Alright. So number 81 is going to be the album Hit Vibes by the one and only Saint Pepsi. I actually met Saint Pepsi last year in Brooklyn, and of course told him how much I loved that album. Alright, number 80. Tourist History. By the band Two Door Cinema Club. There was a guy from my high school who was a senior who introduced me to Two Door Cinema Club when I was young, and I listened to that album a million times. Their second album's really good too. Alright. Number 79. Humans by the band Gorillaz, Damon Albarn. This was the first Gorillaz album that came out after I became a fan, after Plastic Beach came out and was much anticipated. They hadn't put out a new album in a long time, and I absolutely loved it, but a lot of other people thought it was kind of disappointing, but I think it's still held up pretty well. Number 78. Asia by the classic rock duo Steely Dan. It's one of the best crafted albums ever made, just painstakingly produced. These guys are real studio geniuses. Alright, number 77. Televised Tragedies by 18 Karat Affair. You'll see throughout the list there'll be a couple of albums by the same artist, and that won't be the last 18 Karat Affair album either. So number 76. Are You Alone? By the band Magical Clouds. They're a Canadian group. They were pretty short-lived. They only had 2 albums, and this was their last one, but my best friend introduced me to them, and I slowly but surely became obsessed. Very soft, reverent, and artsy. Number 75. Off the Wall. By none other than the great Michael Jackson. This, in my opinion, is the best Michael Jackson album. Here we go with another one. 74. How do you spell it? Nonagon Infinity by once again King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard. The only album that I would say is superior to Flying Microtonal Banana is the one that came right before it. A lot of good things to say about that one. Number 73. In the Airplane Over the Sea. By Neutral Milk Hotel. Another band that was pretty short-lived, but their final album, In the Airplane Over the Sea, kind of cemented them as one of the greatest albums of the 90s. A marvel of lo-fi indie rock. Alright, number 72. Midnight Marauders. By A Tribe Called Quest. I'm a big 90s hip-hop fan, and this is a brilliant album. Very well done. Lots of bangers, lots of hits. Okay. So, number 71. Another hip-hop album. Aquemini. By Outkast. Outkast is one of my favorite rap groups. I think they're a pair of geniuses, and their earlier stuff is far better than their stuff at the end of their career. Alright, number 70. Thrill of the Arts by the band Wolfpack. I got really into Wolfpack right before this album came out, and when it did, it was like nothing I ever heard before. It was one of my early interests in lo-fi funk from their early EPs. Alright, let's move to the next page here. Looks like there's a little bit of bleed through here. So now we're on number 69. And that is going to be Siamese Dream. By the Smashing Pumpkins. I have very early memories of listening to the Smashing Pumpkins, and I wasn't super jived by them. I feel like I came to appreciate them way later in life, and Siamese Dream is definitely my favorite Smashing Pumpkins album. I think it's better than Melancholy. Number 68. Another Deftones album. Diamond Eyes. This is the album that I think well, not the first one I listened to, but I got into, and for a while this was my favorite, but I feel like there's other ones that I've come to appreciate later. 67. This is going to be, it's kind of a long name. The album is called Harmlessness, and the band is called The World is a Beautiful Place and I Am No Longer Afraid to Die. But we'll just call it The World is a Beautiful Place. It's usually what most people call them. I have that one on CD. I saw them unexpectedly opening for another band and I was blown away, and I bought their CD at their show and listened to it a million times. Number 66. Hypnic Jerks. By Spirit of the Beehive. These are currently one of my favorite bands that have been around kind of recently. Their name's actually spelled in all caps, but we'll just leave it at that for now. Number 65. Making Mirrors by Gautier. When this album came out, it was one of my favorite albums at the time. I feel like it's kind of made its way down the list as I've discovered other music since, but a lot of those songs and the music videos for those songs hold a lot of personal value to me, a lot of memories. Number 64. The Waterfall. By My Morning Jacket. Another band that I was really into in high school. A lot of their albums are really good. And this was in my opinion, the last great one that came out. Number 63. "100 Mornings." That's by Windows 96. It's a vaporwave, synthwave classic album that a lot of people know of. I remember coming across this on YouTube, and it was in the back of my mind for years and years, and now I've come to really appreciate it and what it's done for the scene. Number 62. It's going to be 2. I guess it's Roman numerals 2, which is the second album by Unknown Mortal Orchestra. When I first discovered these guys, all the songs that I seem to know were from this album. It is a masterpiece of modern lo-fi. Alright. Number number 61 is going to be the album Shrines by Infinity Frequencies. He's a kind of a sound art, signal wave type musician who's gained a lot of popularity in the era of liminal music. But this album had a lot of kind of beat-driven and groovy songs that were really my style. Number 60. Another Deftones album, Koi no Yoken. This was the first Deftones album I ever listened to in its entirety, and was my favorite for a long time as well. Kind of came out closer to the time that I was interested in them. Alright, number 59. That's going to be The Pleasure Principle by Gary Newman. This album, most people know for the hit single from the 80s, Cars. But it had a lot of great songs that sounded very similar, had similar vibes. It was one of the first new wave albums to replace all the guitars with synthesizers instead. It's number 58. Late Night Delight. By Luxury Elite and Saint Pepsi. This is another album that's not on Spotify, and most of the albums by Lux Elite and all the albums by Saint Pepsi are not on Spotify. But this one was one of my earliest introductions to the vaporwave music genre, and to this day still holds a lot of value. I still listen to it all the time. Alright, number 57. Antics. Another album by Interpol. They're one of my favorite bands, and this is my favorite album by them. But there's been a few other Interpol albums that have been on and off this list before. Number 56. Choose Your Weapon. See if I can spell this. Hiatus Coyote. Choose Your Weapon by Hiatus Coyote. That album, I feel a lot of people who really like music really appreciate the grooves and vibes of this album. It was really one of a kind. Alright, number 55. Odyssey by Home. Home is a guy named Randy Goff who makes a lot of retro synthwave records. He hasn't made too many of them, but this was one of his first ones, and it is iconic to say the least. Number 54. Care by Temporex. This album was another one I randomly came across through YouTube algorithms, and I thought it was incredibly unique. I'd heard nothing like it. It was so minimal and DIY and naive. I feel like none of his other stuff has been as unique and for its time as this album. It's got a lot of re-representation in the era of liminality as well. Number 53. It's going to be Spaceship Earth by Whitewoods. It's a vaporwave artist that I was kind of slow to discovering. Never really heard of them for a while. But when I listened to this album, I was immediately hooked on it. It's very unique. Not a lot of albums at the time, vaporwave albums, had vocals and lyrics to them. Number 52. Another one by Mac DeMarco. This is the first of several Mac DeMarco albums that are going to make it onto this list. I was quite a fan upon discovering him when I first moved to Chicago. Number 51. Trouble Will Find Me. Another album by The National. This is their best album, without a doubt. Tons of great songs, the pinnacle of their career. Number 50. Ramapo River Anthology by DuckTales. I was never super hooked on a lot of DuckTales stuff, at least the stuff that was popular on Spotify. And then somebody recommended this album to me, and it immediately became one of my favorites, and definitely my favorite DuckTales album. Sounds like someone's partying out there. Number 49. This is another one of the newest additions to this list. We're about halfway through here. Ooh Rap by George Clanton. I'm a huge George Clanton fan, and you'll see some more George Clanton on this list, but this album just came out, and after maybe 3 or 4 listens to it, I immediately knew it was going to be one of my favorite albums, and made its way pretty high on this list already, even higher than The National, but not higher than number 48. In Rainbows by Radiohead. There's going to be a couple of Radiohead albums on this list too. They're one of my all-time favorites. And In Rainbows, even though it's not my favorite, I still think it's an incredible record and one of their best. Number by, you guessed it, Gorillaz. This is their debut album, which at the time, well, I didn't listen to it when it first came out, but when I was really getting into the Gorillaz, it wasn't quite up there with Plastic Beach or Demon Days, but now it's become one of my favorite albums of theirs. Number 46. That's going to be 60/40. Another album by 18 Karat Affair. He's one of my favorite artists. I just feel he understands the production aesthetic that drives that soft nerve of nostalgia. An expert in sampling. Number 45. Grow by Chan. Chan is a band that I was really into at the time. I've seen them a bunch of times. Kind of sounds like they're not really going to be continuing on as a band, but I'm glad this one came out because it is a pretty great math rock band. Big influence on my band. Number 44. This is going to be a pretty long title. We must become the pitiless censors of ourselves. It's an album by John Mouse. When John Mouse first started out, his music was kind of odd and cryptic and pretty much revered by critics. But when his third album came out, We Must Become the Pitiless Censors of Ourselves, people started to take him more seriously and consider him more of an outsider artist. Number 43. Breakup Song. By Deerhoof. It's a band that one of my teachers in college introduced me to, and I've loved them ever since. I think their stuff they were releasing around that era is the best, in my opinion. Number 42. E.T. Aliens. By Outkast. This album, I feel like I never listened to any of the music from it when I was growing up. And then when I got really into Outkast in the recent years, I thought it was stupendous. Catalog of music, flow, production. Number 41 is going to be Somersault. By the band Beach Fossils. I never really listened to Beach Fossils until this album came out, and when it did, oh boy, that was quite a doozy. A lot of great songs, great flow through the album, great catalog. I didn't think their last album was as good, though. Alright. We have another Deftones album. around the fur. For a while, this one wasn't really one of my favorites. It kind of felt like the commercial album, the one that everybody knew them for, but friends, bandmates, they are always playing music from this album, and I came to reappreciate it, and it is definitely an album with no skips, as they say. Let's move on to another page. The spine of this notebook is being a little difficult. We are on number 39. I'm not really sure how to pronounce this. It's in German, but it looks like this. And that's by the band Molchadoma. The translation of this, because they're from Belarus, like Russian, and this translates to levels, but I don't know what the Russian pronunciation of it is. But when this album became a huge hit, I was immediately hooked. I think it was one of the most unique things to come out of the dark post-punk scene in a while. And it had been around for a few years by the time it got popular. It's usually how it goes. Number 38, a certified classic. Master of Puppets by the one and only Metallica. Despite Metallica being one of my favorite bands when I was a little kid, well, when I was a spry young metalhead, this is the only album that has made it onto this list. It's the only album I feel has truly aged well in comparison to many of my other favorite albums. But man, is it good. Number 37. The Bends by Radiohead. Their second album. The song Fake Plastic Trees from this album is one of my favorite songs of all time. Number 36. Sex and Food by Unknown Mortal Orchestra. So when this album came out, around the time where I started getting into these guys, and it was a huge deal. It was kind of the album that took them away from the real lo-fi side of their discography and made them a little more commercially friendly, but it had a lot of great songs on it. Number 35. Blank Banshee 1 by the Canadian vaporwave producer Blank Banshee. Despite calling it Blank Banshee 1, this is actually his second album. And at one point, this album and the one before it were both pretty high on this list, but I feel like the other one has aged better than this one, even though they're more or less the same. Now, here's one that's real popular these days. French Exit by TV Girl. I love this album. It is an incredible usage of samples and indie rock that works really well and sounds really pretty. The lyrics are kind of mundane sometimes, but the overall quality of the album just makes me feel very nostalgic. Alright, number 33. Selected Ambient Works, 85 to 92. By Aphex Twin. This was Aphex Twin's first official album, even though it's more of a compilation and it's really not typically ambient as you would think, but it was all comprised of stuff that was made from his home studio as early as 15 years old. And as legend goes, it was the original tapes were chewed upon by his pet cat, which is why they sound so crunchy. Number 32. Destin by Vector Graphics. It's another album that's not on Spotify. There's no Vector Graphics on Spotify, actually. But I've listened to this album 100 times. It's one of the best vaporwave albums in terms of stuff that's very lo-fi and kind of hissy. But just sounds very VHS quality. Number 31. Miracle Mile. I think that's the correct spelling, by Starfucker. This is my favorite Starfucker album. I like a lot of their stuff, but when I first heard this one, I felt it was just pure gold. Tons of bangers, no skips. Here's a classic for you. The Low End Theory. By A Tribe Called Quest. This is a phenomenal hip-hop album that was pretty ahead of its time, far superior to their first album, even though that one's also pretty good. It's the album that definitely got me into them. Pardon me. Number 29. Number 29. OK Computer by Radiohead. This is often regarded as Radiohead's greatest album and one of the best albums of the 90s. And I definitely agree, although I do think Kid A is superior personally. But so much about this album kind of changed what people thought could be popular in mainstream music as far as sad indie. Number 28. He Thinks He's People by Rob Crow. I kind of discovered this album by accident through somebody on YouTube recommended it, and Rob Crow is one of the two members of the band Pinback, who I actually never heard of at the time. But this album by Rob Crow, I personally like more than any Pinback album, as much as I like them. 27. Bigger Than Life by Black Marble. A lot of people like Black Marble's first two albums a lot, and I really did too, but this album came out around the time that I was getting into them, and I just thought it was stupendous. A lot of great, unique post-punk, and production was a little better than the last two. 26. Pom Pom by Ariel Pink. Ariel Pink kind of fell off a little bit due to controversy, but a lot of Ariel Pink albums are albums I listened to a lot back in the day, and this one is his best in my opinion, and just very unique hypnagogic pop. Number 25. I think that's how you spell it. Synchronicity by The Police. This album, despite being not at the top of my personal list, because there's albums that I hold more dear, I think this album is not only one of the best Police albums, but one of the best albums of the 80s. I would put it in maybe the top 10. Better than any Michael Jackson album. Number 24. This Old Dog by Mac DeMarco. I was really into Mac DeMarco around the time that another one came out, the album right before this one. And this one, despite being very different in production quality, was more clean. It still had a lot of great songs that didn't seem simple and mundane like the albums that he had before. There was a kind of a sense of seriousness to this. Songs about not knowing your place, and about his father who walked out on him, and the ideas of growing old. It felt like a turning point for Mac DeMarco. Number 23. Plastic Beach by Gorillaz. For a long time, the album Demon Days was my favorite Gorillaz album, but as I've grown, as years have gone by as a big Gorillaz fan, this one has taken the lead as my favorite Gorillaz album. Demon Days didn't even make it onto this list, ironically enough. Oh, whoops. 22. That is going to be Kid A by Radiohead. Like I said, this is my favorite Radiohead album. I personally think it's their best, but OK Computer is definitely up there. They're really not too far apart from this list here. It was often referred to as one of the biggest left turns in history. The music industry, where a band that was so popular decided to take everything that made them popular and turn it on its head and do something completely different, and it totally worked. Number 21. Torches by Foster the People. A lot of indie pop that was popular at the time, Foster the People, I was really into, but I feel like hasn't aged as well compared to a lot of the music I listen to nowadays. But this album by Foster the People, I feel still holds up. Every song on there is great, and it's their debut, and it's far better than anything they've put out since. Number 20, we're in the top 20 now. This one's kind of interesting. Some may not even think of it as an album, but I guess some of these here aren't even really albums. Hi, how are you? That's a album mixtape by Daniel Johnston. Daniel Johnston's a very interesting and misunderstood musician, and I really didn't listen to him much until after he passed away. And the more and more I learned about him, the more I became fascinated about his life and how he became popular, and I feel he's a prime example of completely untouched music that's made solely to be creative and not made with any intention of being popular or well known. Very unique catalog of songs. Number 19. This Is Happening by LCD Sound System. LCD Sound System was a band that I didn't really listen to until after they broke up, but this was the last album they put out, and it's grown just exponentially in my catalog of music. I've come to really appreciate it over time. The other two LCD Sound System albums from their initial run have been on this list at one point or another too. Number 18. This album was in the top 10 for a long time, but it's kind of slowly been making its way a little bit lower. Discovery by Daft Punk. This is their second album, and it's a brilliantly produced album. I think it's one of the best electronic dance records ever made, and it has aged very well. Number 17. Dots and Loops by Stereolab. Now, Stereolab is a very interesting band. I've listened to so much of their music, but this album, Dots and Loops, from 1994, is still, like, in my opinion, their only album that's, like, truly worth listening to. The rest of their stuff is kind of hit or miss with me, but has such a unique sound. Number 16, Salad Days. Another Mac DeMarco album. We're going to talk a lot about Mac DeMarco because he's one of my favorites. He's a great example of lo-fi indie that's so simple and benign, but also very melodic and easy listening. Number 15. Loveless. By My Bloody Valentine. It's a quintessential vaporwave album that was brilliantly produced and kind of drove the band and the record label to the brink of insanity making it. But it's pretty timeless. It's one of the best aged albums. Number 14. I feel like this album came out around the same time and isn't really too different. Well, that's the band name. My bad. The album is called Heaven or Las Vegas by Cocteau Twins. I think Elizabeth Fraser has one of the best voices in all of alternative rock, and this album is kind of a big thing for them because all their records before were not quite developed as serene as this one, but it's just great. Every song on there is fantastic. Number 13. Inner Speaker. I think it's actually one word, but that is by Tame Impala. You're going to see some more Tame Impala at the top of this list here. But this is his first album, and I think it's just phenomenal. It's, despite being so minimally produced, like produced in his house, it just has such a big sound and sounds so unique. Great songs. Number 12. Violator by Depeche Mode. This was one of my favorite albums growing up. So much that I have this album cover tattooed on my arm. Number 11. It's going to be the other Blank Banshee album, which is the first one titled Blank Banshee Zero. And this one was one of my other early introductions to the vaporwave scene, and it is quite unique and is just brilliantly produced and just really makes you think. We are going to move on to the top 10 here. Alrighty, let's get to it. These are my, as of now, top 10 favorite albums. And number 10, it is another Mac DeMarco album, 2, which is his second album, and the album that I listened to over and over again when I got into Mac DeMarco. Just the chord choices that he uses throughout, the way he layers on both guitars and synths and puts everything together just sounds so primal, but also so smooth and great. Simple. Number 9 is going to be Currents, another Tame Impala album. Tame Impala's, since I first got into them, has always been one of my favorite bands. And when I really started listening to them, Currents came out maybe a year later, and I thought it was just the greatest album ever made. I fantasized about playing the songs of Tame Impala live at my own shows. Number 8. This one actually might surprise a lot of people, but it has been constantly moving up in my list for years. Enter the Wu-Tang, 36 Chambers. By Wu-Tang Clan. That's right. This album from 1993 is, in my opinion, the greatest rap album ever made, and there will never be an album like it. It was made so, it was such a product of its time, and the way it was produced, the way RZA put it together, can never be done again. Nothing sounds like it. It's never even been done on any other Wu-Tang album. This next one, number 7. Disintegration by The Cure. This is surprisingly the only Cure album that's actually on this list, despite them being one of my favorite bands. But several other albums by The Cure, Head on the Door, Pornography, Kiss Me, they've all been on this list at some point, but have just been booted off because none of them just sound as great as Disintegration. But since I listened to it growing up in high school, I've never thought it has lost its quality by any means. Number 6. The Demonstration by Drab Majesty. Discovering this band was a turning point in my life, from an era where I was into a lot of, post-punk and goth rock and stuff, but I hadn't really quite been introduced to the new wave of post-punk that was coming around, and this was the album that defined that era for me. It just so beautifully crafted, such tender melodies, but also dark and mysterious. Number 5. Yep, 2 Tame Impala albums in the top 10. I'm surprised there's not 3. Lonerism, over time, aged better than Currents, in my opinion. I think it's got a very unique place in music history for what it is and how it affected the music scene at the time. A stupendous follow-up to Inner Speaker. Let me write these out. 3, 2, Alright, top 4. This fourth one is probably an album a lot of people haven't heard of. Lamaze by Geneva Jacuzzi. She's kind of more known for being kind of doing like these art installations, these kind of one of a kind, one time only performances. But she put out some music earlier in her career that I feel gets kind of lost and is kind of well known in certain circles. But this album, upon listening to it, just had everything that I was looking for in a record at the time. Just like really unique, nostalgic production, just like really simple synth pop. She hasn't made another album like it since. This next album, for most of my life, since I first discovered it, was my favorite album of all time until a few years ago. Circuital by My Morning Jacket. This album, even though it's not one of My Morning Jacket's most popular albums, it came to me kind of by accident when I was in high school, and I immediately was obsessed. I listened to it so many times, and there were songs from it that just felt like I personally connected to at the time. I felt I could relate, and just for nostalgic value alone, it's been one of my favorite album for a long time before I heard these next two albums, which are somewhat recent. Number 2. This next two are going to be kind of interesting, and you'll see why. Number 2 is Slide by George Clanton. I said there would be more George Clanton, and when I initially started listening to him, I kind of knew that name for a while, but I never listened to his music. But when I really got into him, I was just obsessed with the music that he'd been putting out. It just had a lot of things that I was looking for, like as a musician myself, things that I wasn't sure how to do, how to convey elements of hypnagogia and familiarity in music the way he did, the sort of beats that he used, the way he produced it, the way he combined elements like synthesizers and vocals. And of course, number 1, even more, is 100% Electronica, which is, of course, also by George Clanton. This ranks currently as my favorite album of all time. 100% Electronica by George Clanton. And honestly, these top 2 are pretty evenly matched for favorite albums, because I love them both for different reasons, but this one feels more raw. It feels like an album of self-discovery where George Clanton was finally putting together songs that defined who he was, and they all just sound so good. They make me feel like I'm playing computer games back when I was 6 years old. All the sounds and textures, and reminds me of when I was young, which is the kind of thing that I tried to develop in the music that I make now. And I wouldn't be doing it if it wasn't for George Clanton. He's a huge influence of mine and a huge influence in music these days too. Well, that's it. This here is Toloro's top 100 albums as of September 15th, 2023. A bunch of albums from the same artist, you know. A bunch of Mac DeMarco, Tame Impala, Radiohead, Deftones. A lot of different genres. But everything holds a value in different times of my life, different time periods defined by music. Well, I hope you enjoyed watching, and I hope to maybe make an updated list once I discover new albums a couple years from now. Thanks for watching.